The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. In Part 2, in Fairyland. Snow White. Snow White is one of the best-known fairy tales. It has been told for centuries in various forms in all European countries and languages. From there, it was disseminated to other continents. More often than not, the story's title is simply the name Snow White, although there are many variations. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the name by which the tale is now widely known, is a bowdlerization which unfortunately emphasizes the dwarfs who, failing to develop into mature humanity, are permanently arrested on a pre-Oedipal level. Dwarfs have no parents, nor do they marry or have children, and are but foils to set off the important developments taking place in Snow White. Some versions of Snow White begin, "A count and countess drove by 3 mounds of white snow, which made the count say, 'I wish I had a girl as white as this snow.' A short while later, they came to 3 holes full of red blood, at which he said, 'I wish I had a girl with cheeks as red as this blood.' Finally, 3 black ravens flew by, at which moment he desired a girl with hair as black as these ravens. As they drove on, they encountered a girl as white as snow, as red as blood, and with hair as black as the raven, and she was Snow White. The count immediately made her sit in the coach and loved her, but the countess did not like it and thought only about how she could get rid of her. Finally, she dropped her glove and ordered Snow White to look for it. In the meantime, the coachman had to drive on with great speed. A parallel version differs only in the detail that the couple drive through a forest and Snow White is asked to descend to gather a bunch of beautiful roses which grow there. As she does so, the queen orders the coachman to drive on, and Snow White is deserted. In these renderings of the story, the count and countess, or king and queen, are thinly disguised parents, and the girl so admired by father figure and found by chance as a surrogate daughter. The Oedipal desires of a father and daughter, and how these arouse the mother's jealousy, which makes her wish to get rid of the daughter, are much more clearly stated here than in more common versions. The now widely accepted form of Snow White leaves the Oedipal entanglements to our imagination rather than forcing them on our conscious mind. Whether openly stated or only hinted at, Oedipal difficulties and how the individual solves them are central to the way his personality and human relations unfold. By camouflaging the Oedipal predicaments, or by only subtly intimating the entanglements, fairy stories permit us to draw our own conclusions when the time is propitious for our gaining a better understanding of these problems. Fairy stories teach by indirection. In the versions just mentioned, Snow White is not the count's and countess's child, deeply desired and loved though she is by the count, and jealous though the countess is of her. In the well-known story of Snow White, the jealous older female is not her mother, but her stepmother, and the person for whose love the two are in competition is not mentioned. So the Oedipal problems, source of the story's conflict, are left to our imagination. While, physiologically speaking, the parents create the child, it is the arrival of the child which causes these two people to become parents. Thus, it is the child who creates the parental problems, and with these comes his own. Fairy tales usually begin when the child's life, in some manner, has reached an impasse. In Hansel and Gretel, the children's presence creates hardships for the parents, and because of this, life turns problematic for the children. In Snow White, it is not any external difficulty such as poverty, but the relations between her and her parents which create the problematic situation. As soon as the position of the child within the family becomes a problem to him or to his parents, the process of the child's struggle to escape the triadic existence has begun. With it, he enters the often desperately lonely course to find himself, a struggle in which others serve mainly as foils who facilitate or impede this process. In some fairy tales, the hero has to search, travel, and suffer through years of a lonely existence before he is ready to find, rescue, and join one other person in a relation which gives permanent meaning to both their lives. In Snow White, it is the years Snow White spends with the dwarfs which stand for her time of troubles, of working through problems, her period of growth. Few fairy tales help the hearer to distinguish between the main phases of childhood development as neatly as does Snow White. The earliest entirely dependent pre-Oedipal years are hardly mentioned, as is true of most fairy tales. The story deals essentially with the Oedipal conflicts between mother and daughter, with childhood and finally with adolescence, placing major emphasis on what constitutes a good child and what is needed to grow out of it. The Brothers Grimm's story of Snow White begins. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the snowflakes fell like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window which had a frame of black ebony. And as she was sewing while looking at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. The red looked so beautiful on the white snow that she thought to herself, "I wish I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and with hair as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon after, she got a little daughter who was as white as snow, as red as blood, and had hair as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Snow White. And when the child had been born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took himself another wife. The story begins with Snow White's mother pricking her finger so that 3 drops of red blood fall upon the snow. Here the problems the story sets out to solve are intimated: sexual innocence. Whiteness is contrasted with sexual desire, symbolized by the red blood. Fairy tales prepare the child to accept that is otherwise a most upsetting event, sexual bleeding, as in menstruation and later in intercourse when the hymen is broken. Listening to the first few sentences of Snow White, the child learns that a small amount of bleeding, 3 drops of blood, 3 being the number most closely associated in the unconscious with sex, is a precondition for conception because only after this bleeding is the child born. Here, then, sexual bleeding is closely connected with a happy event. Without detailed explanations, the child learns that without bleeding, no child, not even he, could have been born. Although we are told that her mother died when she was born, during her first years, nothing bad happens to Snow White, despite the fact that her mother is replaced by a stepmother. The latter turns into the typical fairy tale stepmother only after Snow White reaches the age of 7 and starts to mature. Then the stepmother begins to feel threatened by Snow White and becomes jealous. The stepmother's narcissism is demonstrated by her seeking reassurance about her beauty from the magic mirror long before Snow White's beauty eclipses hers. The queen's consulting the mirror about her worth, i.e. beauty, repeats the ancient theme of Narcissus, who loved only himself so much that he became swallowed up by his self-love. It is the narcissistic parent who feels most threatened by his child's growing up because that means the parent must be aging. As long as the child is totally dependent, he remains, as it were, part of the parent. He does not threaten the parent's narcissism. But when the child begins to mature and reaches for independence, then he is experienced as a menace by such a parent, as happens to the queen in Snow White. Narcissism is very much part of the young child's makeup. The child must gradually learn to transcend this dangerous form of self-involvement. The story of Snow White warns of the evil consequences of narcissism for both parent and child. Snow White's narcissism nearly undoes her as she gives in twice to the disguised queen's enticements to make her look more beautiful, while the queen is destroyed by her own narcissism. As long as she remained home, Snow White did nothing. We hear nothing about her life before her expulsion. We are told nothing about her relation to her father, although it is reasonable to assume that it is competition for him which sets stepmother against daughter. The fairy tale views the world and what happens in it not objectively, but from the perspective of the hero, who is always a person in development. Since the hearer identifies with Snow White, he sees all events through her eyes and not through those of the queen. To the girl child, her love for her father is the most natural thing in the world, and so is his love for her. She cannot conceive of this being a problem, short of his not loving her enough in preference to everybody else. Much as the child wants her father to love her more than her mother, she cannot accept that this may create jealousy of her in the mother. But on a preconscious level, the child knows quite well how jealous she is of the attention one parent pays to the other when the child feels she should get that attention. Since the child wants to be loved by both parents, a fact which is well known, but in discussion of the Oedipal situation is frequently neglected because of the nature of the problem, it is much too threatening for the child to imagine what the love for him by one parent may create jealousy in the other. When this jealousy, as is true for the queen in Snow White, cannot be overlooked, then some other reason must be found to explain it, as in the story it is ascribed to the child's beauty. In the normal course of events, the relations of parents to each other are not threatened by the love of one or both parents for their child. Unless the marital relations are quite bad or a parent is very narcissistic, jealousy of a child favored by one parent remains small and well controlled by the other parent. Matters are quite different for the child. First, he cannot find solace for the pangs of jealousy in a good relation such as that his parents have with each other. Second, all children are jealous, if not of their parents, then of the privileges the parents enjoy as adults. When the tender, loving care of the parent of the same sex is not strong enough to build up ever more important positive ties in the naturally jealous Oedipal child, and with it set the process of identification working against this jealousy, then the latter dominates the child's emotional life. Since a narcissistic stepmother is an unsuitable figure to relate to or identify with, Snow White, if she were a real child, could not help being intensely jealous of her mother and all her advantages and powers. If a child cannot permit himself to feel his jealousy of a parent, this is very threatening to his security. He projects his feelings onto this parent. Then, I am jealous of all the advantages and prerogatives of mother, turns into the wishful thought, mother is jealous of me. The feeling of inferiority is defensively turned into a feeling of superiority. The prepubertal or adolescent child may say to himself, I do not compete with my parents. I am already better than they are. It's they who are competing with me. Unfortunately, there are also parents who try to convince their adolescent children that they are superior to them, which the parents may well be in some respects, but for the sake of their child's ability to become secure, they ought to keep this fact to themselves. Worse, there are parents who maintain that they are in all ways as good as their adolescent child. The father who attempts to keep up with the youthful strength and sexual prowess of his son, the mother who tries in looks, dress, and behavior to be as youthfully attractive as her daughter. The ancient history of stories such as Snow White suggests that this is an age-old phenomenon. But competition between a parent and his child makes life unbearable for parent and child. Under such conditions, the child wants to be free himself and be rid of the parent who forces him either to compete or to buckle under. The wish to be rid of the parent arouses great guilt, justified though it may be when the situation is viewed objectively. So, in a reversal which eliminates the guilt feeling, this wish, too, is projected onto the parent. Thus, in fairy tales, there are parents who try to rid themselves of their child, as happens in Snow White. In Snow White, as in Little Red Riding Hood, a male who can be viewed as an unconscious representation of the father appears, the hunter who is ordered to kill Snow White, but instead saves her life. Who else but a father substitute would seem to acquiesce to the stepmother's dominance and nevertheless, for the child's sake, dare to go against the queen's will? This is what the Oedipal and adolescent girl wishes to believe about her father, that even though he does as the mother bids him, he would side with his daughter if he were free to, tricking the mother as he did so. Why are rescuing male figures so often cast in the roles of hunters in fairy tales? While hunting may have been a typically masculine occupation when fairy tales came into being, this is much too easy an explanation. At that time, princes and princesses were as rare as they are today, and fairy tales simply abound with them. But when and where these stories originated, hunting was an aristocratic privilege, which supplies a good reason to see the hunter as an exalted figure like a father. Actually, hunters appear frequently in fairy tales because they lend themselves so well to projections. Every child at some time wishes that he were a prince or a princess, and at times, in his unconscious, the child believes he is one, only temporarily degraded by circumstances. There are so many kings and queens in fairy tales because their rank signifies absolute power, such as the parent seems to hold over his child. So, the fairy tale royalty represent projections of the child's imagination, as does the hunter. The ready acceptance of the hunter figure as a suitable image of a strong and protective father figure, as opposed to the many ineffectual fathers such as the one in Hansel and Gretel, must relate to associations which attach themselves to this figure. In the unconscious, the hunter is seen as the symbol of protection. In this connection, we must consider the animal phobias of which no child is entirely free. In his dreams and daydreams, the child is threatened and pursued by angry animals, creations of his fear and guilt. Only the parent hunter, so he feels, can scare these threatening animals away, keep them permanently from the child's door. Hence, the hunter of fairy tales is not a figure who kills friendly creatures, but one who dominates, controls, and subdues wild, ferocious beasts. On a deeper level, he represents the subjugation of the animal, asocial, violent tendencies in man. Since he seeks out, tracks down, and defeats what are viewed as lower aspects of man, the wolf, the hunter is an eminently protective figure who can, and does, save us from the dangers of our violent emotions and those of others. In Snow White, the pubertal girl's Oedipal struggle is not repressed, but acted out around the mother as competitor. In Snow White's story, the father huntsman fails to take a strong and definite stand. He neither does his duty to the queen nor meets his moral obligation to Snow White to make her safe and secure. He does not kill her outright, but he deserts her in the forest, expecting her to be killed by wild animals. The hunter tries to placate both the mother by seemingly executing her order and the girl by merely not killing her. Lasting hatred and jealousy of the mother are the consequence of the father's ambivalence, which in Snow White are projected onto the evil queen, who therefore continues to reappear in Snow White's life. A weak father is as little use to Snow White as he was to Hansel and Gretel. The frequent appearance of such figures in fairy tales suggests that wife-dominated husbands are not exactly new to this world. More to the point, it is such fathers who either create unmanageable difficulties in the child or fail to help him solve them. This is another example of the important messages fairy tales contain for parents. Why is the mother outright rejecting in these fairy tales while the father is often only ineffectual and weak? The reason the stepmother is depicted as evil and the father as weak has to do with what the child expects of his parents. In the typical nuclear family setting, it is the father's duty to protect the child against the dangers of the outside world and also those that originate in the child's own asocial tendencies. The mother is to provide nurturing care and the general satisfaction of immediate bodily needs required for the child's survival. Therefore, if the mother fails the child in fairy tales, the child's very life is in jeopardy, as happens in Hansel and Gretel when the mother insists that the children must be gotten rid of. If the father out of weakness is negligent in meeting his obligations, then the child's life as such is not directly endangered, although a child deprived of the father's protection must shift for himself as best he can. So Snow White must fend for herself when she is abandoned by the hunter in the forest. Only loving care combined with responsible behavior on the part of both parents permits the child to integrate his Oedipal conflicts. If he is deprived of either by one or both parents, the child will not be able to identify with them. If a girl cannot form a positive identification with her mother, not only does she get stuck in Oedipal conflicts, but regression sets in, as it always does when the child fails to attain the next higher stage of development for which she is chronologically ready. The queen who is fixated to a primitive narcissism and arrested on the oral incorporative stage is a person who cannot positively relate, nor can anybody identify with her. The queen orders the hunter not only to kill Snow White, but to return with her lungs and liver as evidence. When the hunter brings the queen the lungs and liver of an animal to prove he has executed her command, the cook has to cook them in salt, and the bad woman ate them and thought she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver. In primitive thought and custom, one acquires the powers or characteristics of what one eats. The queen, jealous of Snow White's beauty, wanted to incorporate Snow White's attractiveness as symbolized by her internal organs. This is not the first story of a mother's jealousy of her daughter's budding sexuality, nor is it all that rare that a daughter, in her mind, accuses her mother of such jealousy. The magic mirror seems to speak with the voice of a daughter rather than that of a mother. As the small girl thinks her mother is the most beautiful person in the world, this is what the mirror initially tells the queen. But as the older girl thinks she is much more beautiful than her mother, this is what the mirror says later. A mother may be dismayed when looking into the mirror. She compares herself to her daughter and thinks to herself, "My daughter is more beautiful than I am." But the mirror says, "She is 1,000 times more beautiful." A statement much more akin to an adolescent's exaggeration, which he makes to enlarge his advantages and silence his inner voice of doubt. The pubertal child is ambivalent in his wish to be much better than his parent of the same sex because the child fears that if this were actually so, the parent, still much more powerful, would take terrible revenge. It is the child who fears destruction because of his imagined or real superiority, not the parent who wishes to destroy. The parent may suffer pangs of jealousy if he, in his turn, has not succeeded in identifying with his child in a very positive way, because only then can he take vicarious pleasure in his child's accomplishments. It is essential that the parent identify strongly with his child of the same sex for the child's identification with him to prove successful. Whenever the Oedipal conflicts are revived in the pubertal child, he finds life with his family unbearable because of his violently ambivalent feelings. To escape his inner turmoil, he dreams of being the child of different and better parents with whom he would have none of these psychological difficulties. Some children even go beyond such fantasizing and actually run away in search of this ideal home. Fairy tales, however, implicitly teach the child that it exists only in an imaginary country and that when found, it often turns out to be far from satisfying. This is true for Hansel and Gretel and also for Snow White. While Snow White's experience with a home away from home is less scary than Hansel and Gretel's, it does not work out too well either. The dwarfs are unable to protect her, and her mother continues to have power over her, which Snow White cannot help giving her, as symbolized by Snow White's permitting the queen in her various disguises entry into the house, despite the dwarfs' warnings to beware of the queen's tricks and not let anybody in. One cannot free oneself from the impact of one's parents and one's feelings about them by running away from home, although that seems the easiest way out. One succeeds in gaining independence only by working through one's inner conflicts, which children usually try to project onto their parents. At first, every child wishes that it would be possible to evade the difficult work of integration, which, as Snow White's story also shows, is fraught with great dangers. For a time, it seems feasible to escape this task. Snow White lives a peaceful existence for a while, and under the guidance of the dwarves, she grows from a child helpless to deal with the difficulties of the world into a girl who learns to work well and to enjoy it. This is what the dwarfs request of her for living with them. She can remain with them and lack nothing if you will take care of our household, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and will keep everything clean in a good order. Snow White becomes a good housekeeper, as is true of many a young girl who, with mother away, takes good care of her father and house and even her siblings. Even before she meets the dwarfs, Snow White shows that she can control her oral cravings, great as they are. Once in the dwarf's house, though very hungry, she eats just a little from each of the 7 plates and drinks just a drop from each of the 7 glasses so as to rob none of them too much. How different from Hansel and Gretel, the orally fixated children who disrespectfully and voraciously eat up the gingerbread house. After having satisfied her hunger, Snow White tries out all 7 beds, but one is too long, another too short, until finally she falls asleep in the 7th bed. Snow White knows that these are all some other person's beds, and that each bed's owner will want to sleep in his bed despite Snow White's lying in it. Her exploration of every bed suggests she is dimly aware of this risk, and she tries to settle into one where no such risk is involved. And she is right, the dwarfs on coming home are very much taken with her beauty, but the 7th dwarf, in whose bed she is sleeping, does not claim it, but instead slept with his companions 1 hour with each until the night had passed. Given the popular view of Snow White's innocence, the notion that she may have subconsciously risked being in bed with a man seems outrageous. But Snow White shows, by permitting herself to be tempted 3 times by the queen in disguise, that, like most humans, and most of all, adolescents, she is quite easily tempted. However, Snow White's inability to resist temptation makes her all the more human and attractive, without the hearer of the story becoming consciously aware of this. On the other hand, her behavior in restraining herself in eating and drinking, her resisting sleeping in a bed that is not just right for her, shows that she also has learned to control some degree her id impulses and to subject them to superego requirements. We find that her ego too has matured, since now she works hard and well and shares with others. Dwarfs, these diminutive men, have different connotations in various fairy tales. Like the fairies themselves, they can be good or bad. In Snow White, they are of the helpful variety. The first thing we learn about them is that they have returned home from working as miners in the mountains. Like all dwarfs, even the unpleasant ones, they are hardworking and clever at their trade. Work is the essence of their lives. They know nothing of leisure or recreation. Although dwarfs are immediately impressed by Snow White's beauty and moved by her tale of misfortune, they make it clear right away that the price of living with them is engaging in conscientious work. The 7 dwarfs suggest the 7 days of the week, days filled with work. It is this working world Snow White has to make her own if she is to grow up well. This aspect of her sojourn with the dwarfs is easily understood. European fairy tales and legends were often residuals of pre-Christian religious themes which become unacceptable because Christianity would not brook pagan tendencies in open form. In a fashion, Snow White's perfect beauty seems distantly derived from the sun. Her name suggests the whiteness and purity of strong light. According to the ancients, 7 planets circle the sun, hence the 7 dwarfs. Dwarfs or gnomes in Teutonic lore are workers of the earth, extracting metals of which only 7 were commonly known in past times, another reason why these miners are 7 in number. And each of these 7 metals were related to one of the planets in ancient natural philosophy, gold to the sun, silver to the moon, etc. These connotations are not readily available to the modern child, but the dwarfs evoke other unconscious associations. There are no female dwarfs. While all fairies are female, wizards are their male counterparts, and there are both sorcerers and sorceresses or witches. So dwarfs are eminently male, but males who are stunted in their development. These little men with their stunted bodies and their mining occupation, they skillfully penetrate into dark holes, all suggest phallic connotations. They are certainly not men in any sexual sense. Their way of life, their interest in material goods to the exclusion of love, suggest a pre-Oedipal existence. At first sight, it may seem strange to identify a figure that symbolizes a phallic existence as also representing childhood before puberty, a period during which all forms of sexuality are relatively dormant. But the dwarfs are free of inner conflicts and have no desire to move beyond their phallic existence to intimate relations. They are satisfied with an identical round of activities. Their life is a never-changing circle of work in the womb of the earth, as the planets circle endlessly in a never-changing path in the sky. This lack of change or of any desire for it is what makes their existence parallel that of the prepubertal child. And this is why the dwarfs do not understand or sympathize with the inner pressure which make it possible for Snow White to resist the queen's temptation. Conflicts are what make us dissatisfied with our present way of life and induce us to find other solutions. If we are free of conflicts, we would never run the risks involved in moving on a different and, we hope, higher form of living. The peaceful pre-adolescent period Snow White has while living with the dwarfs before the queen again disturbs her gives her the strength to move into adolescence. Thus she enters once more a time of troubles, now no longer as a child who must passively suffer what mother inflicts on her, but as a person who must take part in and responsibility for what happens to her. Snow White and the queen's relations are symbolic of some severe difficulties which may occur between mother and daughter, but they are also projections onto separate figures of tendencies which are incompatible with one person. Often these inner contradictions originate in a child's relationships with his parents. Thus, the fairy tale projection of one side of an inner conflict onto a parental figure also represents a historic truth. This is where it originated. This is suggested by what happens to Snow White when her quiet and uneventful life with the dwarfs is interrupted. Nearly destroyed by the early pubertal conflict and competition with her stepmother, Snow White tries to escape back into conflict-free latency period where sex remains dormant and hence adolescent turmoils can be avoided. But neither time nor human development remains static, and returning to a latency existence to escape the troubles of adolescence cannot succeed. As Snow White becomes an adolescent, she begins to experience the sexual desires which were repressed and dormant during latency. With this, the stepmother, who represents the consciously denied elements in Snow White's inner conflict, reappears on the scene and shatters Snow White's inner peace. The readiness with which Snow White repeatedly permits herself to be tempted by the stepmother, despite the warnings of the dwarfs, suggests how close the stepmother's temptations are to Snow White's inner desires. The dwarf's admonition to let nobody enter the house, or, symbolically, Snow White's inner being, is to no avail. The dwarfs have an easy time preaching against adolescent dangers because, being fixated to the phallic stage of development, they are not subjected to them. Snow White's third experience with temptation finally ends her efforts to return to immaturity when encountering adolescent difficulties. While we are not told how long Snow White lived with the dwarfs before her stepmother reappeared in her life, it is the attraction of stay laces which induces Snow White to let the queen, disguised as a peddler woman, enter the dwarf's dwelling. This makes it clear that Snow White is by now a well-developed adolescent girl and, in line with the fashion of times past, in need of and interested in laces. The stepmother laces Snow White so tightly that she falls down as if she were dead. Now, if the queen's purpose was to kill Snow White, she could easily have done so at this moment. But if the queen's goal was to prevent her daughter from surpassing her, reducing her to immobility is sufficient for a time. The queen then stands for a parent who temporarily succeeds in maintaining his dominance by arresting his child's development. On another level, the meaning of this episode is to suggest Snow White's conflicts about her adolescent desire to be well-laced because it makes her sexually attractive. Her collapsing unconscious symbolizes that she became overwhelmed by the conflict between her sexual desires and her anxiety about them. Since it is Snow White's own vanity which seduces her into letting herself be laced, she and the vain stepmother have much in common. It seems that Snow White's adolescent conflicts and desires are her undoing. But the fairy tale knows better, and it continues to teach the child a more significant lesson. Without having experienced and mastered those dangers which come with growing up, Snow White would never be united with her prince. On the return from work, the good dwarves find Snow White unconscious and unlace her. She comes to life again. She retreats temporarily into latency. The dwarfs warn her once more, and more seriously, against the tricks of the evil queen, that is, against the temptations of sex. But Snow White's desires are too strong. When the queen, disguised as an old woman, offers to fix Snow White's hair, "Now I will comb you properly for once," Snow White is again seduced and lets her do it. Snow White's conscious intentions are overwhelmed by her desire to have a beautiful coiffure. Snow White's conscious intentions are overwhelmed by her desire to have a beautiful coiffure, and her unconscious wish is to be sexually attractive. Once more, this wish is poisonous to Snow White in her early, immature adolescent state, and she again loses consciousness. Again, the dwarfs rescue her. The third time Snow White gives in to temptation, she eats of the fateful apple which the queen, dressed up as a peasant woman, hands to her. The dwarfs can no longer help her then, because regression from adolescence to a latency existence has ceased to be a solution for Snow White. In many myths, as well as fairy tales, the apple stands for love and sex in both its benevolent and its dangerous aspect. An apple given to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, showing she was preferred to chaste goddesses, led to the Trojan War. It was the biblical apple which man was seduced to forswear his innocence in order to gain knowledge and sexuality. While it was Eve who was tempted by male masculinity as represented by the snake, not even the snake could do it all by himself. It needed the apple, which in religious iconography also symbolizes the mother's breast. On our mother's breast, we are all first attracted to form a relation and find satisfaction in it. In Snow White, mother and daughter share the apple. That which is symbolized by the apple in Snow White is something mother and daughter have in common, which runs even deeper than their jealousy of each other, their mature sexual desires. To overcome Snow White's suspicion of her, the queen cuts the apple in half, eating the white part herself, while Snow White accepts the red, poisonous half. Repeatedly we have been told of Snow White's double nature. She was as white as snow and as red as blood. That is, her being as both its asexual and its erotic aspect. Eating the red, erotic part of the apple is the end of Snow White's innocence. The dwarfs, the companions of her latency existence, can no longer bring her back to life. Snow White has made her choice, which is as necessary as it is fateful. The redness of the apple evokes sexual associations like the 3 drops of blood which led to Snow White's birth, and also menstruation, the event which marks the beginning of sexual maturity. As she eats of the red part of the apple, the child in Snow White dies and is buried in a transparent coffin made of glass. There she rests for a long time, visited not only by the dwarfs, but also by 3 birds, first an owl, then a raven, and last a dove. The owl symbolizes wisdom. The raven, as in the Teutonic god Woden's raven, probably mature consciousness, and the dove stands traditionally for love. These birds suggest that Snow White's death-like sleep in the coffin is a period of gestation, which is her final period of preparing for maturity. Snow White's story teaches that just because one has reached physical maturity, one is by no means intellectually and emotionally ready for adulthood, as represented by marriage. Considerable growth and time are needed before the new, more mature personality is formed and the old conflicts are integrated. Only then is one ready for a partner of the other sex and the intimate relation with him, which is needed for the achievement of mature adulthood. Snow White's partner is the prince, who carries her off in her coffin, which causes her to cough up or spit out the poisonous apple and come to life, ready for marriage. Her tradition began with oral incorporative desires, the queen's wish to eat Snow White's internal organs. Snow White's spitting out of the suffocating apple, the bad object she had incorporated, marks her final freedom from primitive orality, which stands for all her immature fixations. Like Snow White, each child in his development must repeat the history of man, real or imagined. We are all expelled eventually from the original paradise of infancy, where all our wishes seem to be fulfilled without any effort on our part. Learning about good and evil, gaining knowledge, seems to split our personality in two, the red chaos of unbridled emotions, the id, and the white purity of our conscience, the superego. As we grow up, we vacillate between being overcome by the turmoil of the first and the rigidity of the second, the tight lacing, and the immobility enforced by the coffin. Adulthood can be reached only when these inner contradictions are resolved and a new awakening of the mature ego is achieved, in which red and white coexist harmoniously. But before the happy life can begin, the evil and destructive aspects of our personality must be brought under our control. The witch is punished for her cannibalistic desires in Hansel and Gretel by being burned in the oven. In Snow White, the vain, jealous, and destructive queen is forced to put on red-hot shoes in which she must dance until she dies. Untrammeled sexual jealousy, which tries to ruin others, destroys itself, as symbolized not only by the fiery red shoes, but by death from dancing in them. Symbolically, the story tells that uncontrolled passion must be restrained or it will become one's undoing. Only the death of the jealous queen, the elimination of all outer and inner turbulence, can make for a happy world. Many fairy tale heroes at a crucial point in their development fall into a deep sleep or are reborn. Each reawakening or rebirth symbolizes the reaching of a higher stage of maturity and understanding. It is one of the fairy tale's ways to stimulate the wish for higher meaning in life, deeper consciousness, and more self-knowledge and greater maturity. The long period of inactivity before reawakening makes the hearer realize, without consciously verbalizing it, that this rebirth requires a time of rest and concentration in both sexes. Changes signifies the need to give up something one had enjoyed up to then, such as Snow White's existence before the queen became jealous, or her easy life with the dwarfs, difficult and painful growing up experiences which cannot be avoided. These stories also convince the hearer that he need not be afraid of relinquishing his childish position of depending on others, since after the dangerous hardships of the transitional period, he will emerge on a higher and better plane to enter upon a richer and happier existence. Those who are reluctant to risk such a transformation, such as the two older brothers in The Three Feathers, never gain the kingdom. Those who got stuck in the pre-Oedipal stage of development, such as the dwarfs, will never know the happiness of love and marriage. And those parents who, like the queen, act out parental Oedipal jealousies nearly destroy their child and certainly destroy themselves.